Funding for the Hinckley Report is made possible in part by the George S. and Dolores Doré Eccles Foundation and the Cleone Peterson Eccles Endowment Fund.
Tonight on the Hinckley Report, an eventful year in politics. What stories rocked our nation's capital? How did Utah's leaders play a part? And what national issues affected our state most? Utah saw a historic turnout in the 2018 midterms. What issues drove voters to the polls? How did lawmakers respond? What stories captured our attention? Which ones flew under the radar? And how will they impact Utah? Good evening, and welcome to the Hinckley Report. I'm Jason Perry, director of the Hinckley Institute of Politics. Covering the week, we have Max Roth, anchor and political reporter with Fox 13 News, Lisa Riley Roche, political reporter with the Deseret News, and Matt Canham, senior managing editor with the Salt Lake Tribune. So glad to have you all here today.
Good to be here.
This is going to be a great show. This is our year in review. We're going to talk about all the big stories that happened in the state and in our country, and because you all are covering these stories so well, we're going to go through what you think the stories were that had the biggest impact. Max, we're going to start with you. All right, when you look back over this year, what stands out?
You know what comes to me? Utah is such a strange and wonderful place, and culturally, I'm always wondering, okay, what's under the surface of all this? I'm going to go back to January. Russell M. Nelson became president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And I think there's a through line with some of what happened this year and how the LDS Church played into that. When I think about him, I think about talking about the name of the church and some of the emphasis that we see, because we had two people who were very much public relations related prior to that. And then I think about some of the issues that came up, like Proposition 2 and marijuana, the LDS Church coming out against it, and losing. And that is that undercurrent, I think, is really interesting. Matt actually had it. Matt, I'm going to steal your thunder.
Okay, you go for it.
You had one of the most interesting stories of the year, which was about how Salt Lake County became minority LDS in this last year as well, or in the last couple of years. I forget exactly what it was.
That's interesting. Oh, go ahead, Lisa.
Oh, well, I was going to jump in with a more traditional political story, and that's the 4th congressional district race between Representative Mia Love, the Republican, and Salt Lake County Mayor Ben McAdams, the Democrat. Utah once again gets a Democrat back in Washington at the same time when Democrats are taking control of the House. So it was a very close race, and it went on and on and on. Matt and I were talking before the show. He was saying he wished it would never be over because it was such a great story.
Yeah.
This is good for business.
But the reality was we had to wait a long time to find out who was going to go back to Washington. And so it's going to be fascinating to see what Utah is going to be like with a Democrat in the mix back in D.C. again.
So Matt, how will it change? Because we do. The House is now in the hands of the Democrats, and we have a Democrat.
Yeah, and we've been here before with Jim Matheson, so we've seen a little bit how this happens. One of the interesting parts, because it's such a close win, I mean, we're talking, what was it, 700 votes? The Democrats need to try to protect Ben McAdams, which means he'll have more leeway to take the votes that he needs to take. So he said that he's going to vote against Nancy Pelosi for Speaker. I assume he'll do that even though she's cut a deal to be Speaker, because they need to protect him, give him more leeway. So he will be one of the more centrist members of our Congress. But it also means that he could get some things for his district that maybe you wouldn't have if you were just a standard Democrat in the majority. If there's a big budget deal and he has something he's interested in, they might say, look, we need to help Ben keep that seat. Let's give him this one. How he actually interacts with his leadership and with the Republicans as he tries to walk this line will be one of the more interesting stories of the coming year.
Especially since we're seeing a split with the Democrats that were elected in this last cycle, right? Some very, very progressive new members, and some of what we used to call blue dog Democrats, like Ben McAdams, right? More conservative, more middle of the road, more moderate, whatever term they're going to use to be more electable in 2 years. we're going to have to see how that split plays out. But I think Matt's right. I think it is an opportunity for McAdams to align himself with the more moderate wing of the Democratic Party and start pushing issues in that direction. And frankly, given all the division in Washington, that may well be what voters want, are candidates that aren't as extreme, whether it's extreme left or extreme right, and are willing to go more middle of the road and get things done back in D.C.
It is going to be a tough seat to hold, though. A tough seat to hold. That is, Ben McAdams won, but he had some tailwinds in terms of the larger political picture, moving against Republicans nationally within the suburbs, those sorts of things. Ben McAdams uniquely positioned as a popular Utah Democrat, a county mayor who had that experience and that name ID. But boy, going into the next election, he may be facing more headwinds.
Talk about a couple of those kind of the perfect storm things that happened in this cycle that may not be there during the next race.
Well, you know what? One thing is, that will be there in the next race most likely is the president. The President Trump is not necessarily popular among Utahns compared to how popular he is in other red states. He is still popular among Utah Republicans, not so much as a Romney or a George W. Bush, but still is. But there will also be in this coming race, there will be a Democrat running for the White House, and there will be so Republicans will be more motivated to come out and vote against that Democrat, even if they're not big fans of President Trump. And so that should play in the Republicans' favor.
I do think that's, I'm sorry, but I do think that's one of the big things is that when you look at this year, it's such a unique midterm year. It was fascinating. Because the president's not popular, even though the president was a Republican, that's a unique dynamic in the state that we haven't had in I don't even know how long. And then you have the propositions on top of it.
Yeah.
What brings people out to vote are races that are competitive or that impact your life. And Utah's been one of the lower voting states because the votes tend to be pro forma. If you look at the Senate race where Mitt Romney won, when it got to the general, all the energy got sucked out of that race because it's a Republican state. All the polls had him up by 30 points.
It's Mitt Romney.
It's Mitt Romney. We're done. It doesn't mean Mitt Romney's not an interesting political figure. It means if you're a voter, that's not what's going to drive you to vote. Yeah. But if you have a close congressional race, if you have interesting propositions, which we haven't had in quite a while, and we had a bunch of them, we had such an interesting dynamic that there could be propositions in 2020. We don't know. There was success this year, so that might encourage people to try again. But that's something you can't count on if you're a Ben McAdams. And then, as you point out, Republicans will have someone to shoot at.
Well, it depends, though, on who the Democrats nominate for president.
That's true.
Going back to this idea that the Democratic Party has its own split between the progressives and the more moderates. If there's a very progressive Democratic candidate on the ballot in Utah, yeah, that probably will hurt Ben McAdams and other Democrats who are looking for help at the top of the ticket. But if it's a more moderate Democrat, someone like a Joe Biden, who was just here at the university, maybe compared to Trump, and let's remember, Trump had his lowest margin of victory in 2016 in Utah. He won, but only with 45% of the vote. And his popularity, it's gone up and down a little bit here since, but he's still not all that popular. It might make it easier for people to look at a Democrat again.
You know what I think is fascinating about, we're still talking about that Love McAdams race and what happened there. Utah County, even though they voted overwhelmingly for Mia Love, those who voted, Utah County in this race was too Republican to help a Republican. Because, like you're saying, if there's a competitive race, people show up. Well, in Utah County, there hasn't been a competitive race in modern memory because they haven't elected a Democrat to anything. And so voters in Utah County showed up in lower numbers than anywhere else in the state. Yes, and that's Mia Love's stronghold. The people who did show up voted for her 3-1. And Ben McAdams just won by 5% or so in Salt Lake County. But people were excited to vote in Salt Lake County, and in Utah County, they didn't come out in numbers.
Well, let's remember, though, one of the reasons the numbers are so low in Utah County is they had real problems at the polls. There are a number of reasons for that. People didn't really seem to take to the idea of mail-in ballots in Utah County. They wanted to show up on Election Day like they always had, but because of the mail-in nature of that race or that election, they didn't have the same number of polling places, so there were long lines. They weren't staffed properly, some people have alleged. And a lot of people stood in line for a long time before going home or showed up at the polls and left. So I don't think Utah County, they have a new clerk auditor. There's a lot of pressure, criticism from the governor on down. So I don't think they're going to make that mistake again of not being able to accommodate all the people that do show up. Because I think the enthusiasm was there. I think because they didn't mail in their ballots, they wanted to vote in public or on Election Day in person, and it was made difficult for them. A lot of people who would have voted didn't.
Matt, before we get to the next story from you, take a second on Mia Love. All right, we can't really finish this conversation without what's going to happen with her. She's been very public.
Very
a couple
public.
Speeches. Talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, she went dark after the Election Day. There were some statements, but nothing from her. After her defeat, she had a news conference, which was unusual in the way that she conceded. She had a lot of criticism for not only her opponent, which she called a wolf in sheep's clothing, but also for her own party and the way the party has responded to minorities. It is a criticism that some Republicans have found pretty hurtful, but it's one that she has continued in an op-ed in the Washington Post, on all the 24-hour news networks. She's going to continue to beat the drum. The Republicans need to change the way they interact with people of color. What that means for her future is kind of interesting. She says she's not going away. So what does that mean? I think we don't know yet.
Okay, we'll watch that one. Significant story, impactful story in the state that you'd like to discuss.
You know, I think the propositions, and Proposition 2 in particular, was the most impactful story of the year because it changed the political dynamic. It had impacts on all of the other races, on the legislature, and on our state going forward. This was the fight over medical marijuana. And it's something that the legislature has dealt with for a few years, but it's never really gone far. In this January, they did do a little medical marijuana bill, but there was a lot of momentum to get it on the ballot. And then once it's on the ballot, that changed the dynamic. It was very popular. It was very popular among Republicans and Democrats, among all age groups. When the Hinckley Institute and the Tribune polled, it did well across the board. And then the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints came out in opposition. And what we saw was active Latter-day Saints were in favor of about in the low 50 percentile range. And in our next poll, it dropped to the 20-25% range.
Wow.
A gigantic dip, and it changed the conversation. Now, as we all know, Proposition 2 passed. The legislature quickly had a special session and replaced it with a bill that changes some of the details. But we're going to be a state that implements medical marijuana. And the one thing that's interesting about election years is essentially they set up what are the big things we are going to do as the state going forward. And this is one of those that, how do we make this program work? Because it's unusual when compared to the other 30 states that have medical marijuana.
It is such a, and it's one of those things that's, it's always funny about Utah anyway, is that we have, you think about our leadership and the composition, and they're the ones who sell alcohol in the state. They're in charge of that. And now they're in charge of figuring out how to grow and sell marijuana, and it's an unusual circumstance. But it also points to this, to one other larger issue that comes up in this race, and I keep on pounding on these population issues, but it's Salt Lake County flexing its muscle, because as you watch the results come in, Salt Lake County was so strongly in favor of these propositions that won, and ultimately that muscle coming from this largest county in the state overcame opposition almost everywhere else. Summit County, Grand County, Weber County, right on the edge on both marijuana and Medicaid.
What's going to be interesting is how the other propositions fare that passed. Medicaid expansion that you just mentioned was approved by voters, something that was stalled in the legislature for a long time. The chief opponent, the outgoing House Speaker Greg Hughes, kept that from going forward. There were a lot of concerns among conservative Republicans about the eventual cost of that to the state, and I've talked to a few. There still is that concern. So the question is, what do they do going forward? And the other one is the redistricting initiative, which kind of goes to what you're saying about Salt Lake County, and the muscle that was flexed, right, from there. One of the frustrations in Salt Lake County is that there is not a designated congressional seat that encompasses that muscle. Instead, all of the congressional seats have been divided to include rural areas of the state to dilute some of that sentiment in Salt Lake County. So now there's a new initiative creating an independent commission to advise lawmakers on how to redraw boundaries, not just for the congressional districts, but also for the legislature and the state school board. So the question is will lawmakers feel empowered now that they've acted on Proposition 2 to step in and take action on those as well?
I think we have to address it. Max, maybe take a second on this, because the legislature is changing the language of those propositions, and there's at least one lawsuit continuing on that issue. And what people don't really understand is the legislature does get to change that. So how do people feel that you are interviewing, based on what Lisa and Matt were just saying, about what will the legislature do, and how bound are they, or do they feel to what the citizens of the state said?
Well, it's entirely, being bound is entirely a question of how much they feel that people are going to hold them to what those votes were. And these legislators, when you talk to them, they don't necessarily feel beholden to the results of these resolutions, because their constituents, in their districts, did not favor them. So if you're, if you are a Republican legislator, it's most likely that your constituents did not favor Proposition 2, and so you can say, hey, the people who sent me up here want this held back. As I talk to people, to voters, about the medical marijuana issue, I think they feel fuzzy about, okay, how much is this changing? How much does this new compromise actually change the substance of the bill? Because I think there is real upset about the idea that they would get rid of something that was voted on.
I think part of it is the speed in which it happened. I mean, the proposition went into law, was it December 1st, and by the 3rd it was changed. It's the fact that they could have waited till the regular session to do that if they wanted to. These should be tweaked over time. That's why we have legislators. That's the point of big, complicated policy issues. Is when you talk about Medicaid, well, we've all been up there. They talk about Medicaid every session. There are little tweaks here and there all the time. The idea that it would stay the same is not practical when it comes to major policy. But I do think there is an expectation that when the voters vote in the majority for an idea, that the idea survives. And as you talked about, there's individual members of the legislature who might not feel beholden, but the governor is in a different situation.
Good point.
And the governor has even talked about, if they want to come and take apart the Independent Redistricting Commission, he's not in favor of that. The voters spoke, they wanted it, it should happen. Do they tweak it in some ways? I would be surprised if they don't in the coming years.
Well, and Prop 2 was a different situation, right? I mean, we had a lot of groups come out early on, well before the vote, to say that there were problems and they wanted to see something different.
Including the supporters.
Including many of the supporters, yes. And you had major groups like the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Salt Lake Chamber, the Medical Association, and others saying very strongly that the way the proposition was worded was problematic, that there needed to be something different. There was, when voters went to the polls, they knew that lawmakers were going to come back into special session and fix that. So the reality is, even though lawmakers may not like these other propositions, they don't have the force behind them of these major groups saying, yes, this needs to be changed. Yes, we need to do it right away. And yes, this is what it needs to look like.
I love the conversation about these big issues. Let's talk about maybe some of the more subtle issues of the day. Who has one that you've been following closely, has impact on the state that didn't quite get the attention of these other stories?
Well, we could talk about the Olympics, right?
Let's talk about the Olympics.
I think people are having. There's just so much going on. I think people are having a hard time wrapping themselves around the idea that, hey, the Olympics may be coming back to Utah. Maybe not right away. Maybe in 2030, maybe in 2034, possibly 2026. I think it's something that's kind of under the radar for a lot of people, even though the U.S. Olympic Committee is about to decide possibly whether or not to advance a bid for a unnamed future games. And the reality is that's going to have a huge impact on this state. Not only is it a lot of private money going into putting on the games, a lot of effort, a lot of volunteers and all of that, as we all remember from 2002. It's also an opportunity to drive some of the things that might need to be done in the community, whether it's upgrading I-15 yet again, whether it's improving transportation up to Park City, up to the canyon.
Could be a huge issue.
Exactly. Air quality is one that came up actually in a discussion this week. The head of the Utah, or the Ski Utah, the industry association, said last time Utah got a pass on issues like air quality because the Olympics happened right after 9/11. There was nothing but goodwill, nothing but patriotism. But this time people are going to notice the air quality issues and are going to raise concerns about it.
Max, how do Utahns feel about the Olympic Games?
Well, overwhelmingly supportive, and you talk to those people who are seeking the bid, and they feel like it's a slam dunk that Denver doesn't have a chance against Utah because the infrastructure is there, and public support, they say, is a gigantic part of that because Denver is the competition, and there's not as much public support in Denver. I wonder what happens if Denver gets it. If there's this sense of kind of the put upon unappreciated little brother, of Denver. If that were to happen, because I don't have a sense of that dynamic and how much Denver turned down the games. They had them and then said, no, we're not going to do it. I really don't have a sense of the competition there.
It is definitely a competition, and part of what's interesting about Denver's bid is one of their options is to use some of the facilities somewhere else, like say Salt Lake City. They're talking about the more expensive venues, the sliding track where bobsled, luge, and skeleton competitions are held, the speed skating oval, the ski jumps. Their bid actually spells out it could be Utah, it could be like Placid, it could be up in Canada, in Calgary or Vancouver. And their thinking is that the International Olympic Committee is looking for cities that are more creative in how they put together an Olympic bid to keep costs down, to not saddle communities with facilities that are no longer used, because Utah is fairly unique in continuing to not just maintain those facilities, but use them, not just for international competition, but also to build up athletes in the Olympic world.
Matt? Do you have a comment first?
Well, I was going to say I was going to jump topics and talk about one of the issues that I think went under the radar was the big changes in San Juan County. This is the Four Corners region.
Oh, yeah.
By court order, they had to redistrict. The argument was that this is an area that's majority American Indian, mostly Navajo. They don't have the voting power that they should. And the court said, we're going to redraft these. The county refused. The court did it themselves. The election happened, and now the majority of the county commission is going to be run by Navajos. And the interesting part is not just the self-governance in that area, but the dynamic that has on the public lands debate that we talk about in our whole state. You look at the Bears Ears National Monument, the president came here and shrunk it, it's in court. That's something that will be ongoing and that they will play a role in. You hear our legislature say that, and our elected officials in Washington say that there should be local input on how these things are run. Well, the local input is about to change drastically. Those two members are on, the board that helped push for Bears Ears to be created. If we're going to listen to local input from local elected officials, that sea change is going to be a very interesting thing that we play out when we talk about oil and gas in our state when we talk about there's uranium down there, and there's interest in mining that more than we have in the past. There's public lands issues. There's issues with those American Indians that hasn't been addressed in the way that they would like. I think it's going to be a really fascinating part of our state to watch.
Yeah, I just spent a few days down there. I was at Natural Bridges, but in Grand Gulch and in this whole area around Bears Ears. That is going to be a big deal to watch that court case. There are 3 court cases going through for a Grand Staircase, Escalante, and Bears Ears. But but it's I think it's Sixes who comes out ahead in that case. I mean, there's kind of the assumption in the political world that those have already been shrunk, but you buy a map down there, and Bears Ears is still Obama's Bears Ears.
Yeah, that's right. Lisa, what kind of impact is it going to have that we now have representation from the tribes down there on the county commission?
Well, we always think of the area as very conservative, right? And in line with a Republican position on public lands. And as Matt was saying, that could change very, very much with that shift. But that's been an ongoing issue down there, right? I mean, the federal government has looked at how they conduct elections down there for
long time.
years and years and years, and actually brought in observers, right, to monitor elections. So it's something that we probably are just not paying enough attention to up here along the Wasatch Front.
A big part of the population, they don't have mailing addresses, and that's a difficulty with vote-by-mail elections. A large number only speak Navajo, and that's not even a written language, and so it's so there are really unique issues there.
We're going to be following that one very closely. Fascinating discussion. You all covered the year so well. Thank you very much for that. Well, that's it for the Hinckley Report. For more on this week's issues, please visit us online at kued.org/Hinckley Report. I'm Jason Perry. Thank you and good night.